Part I, the last man of the war. The jungle was silent, heavy with heat and the sound of distant waves. It was 1974, nearly 30 years since the end of the Second World War. And yet, deep within the dense forests of Lubang Island in the Philippines, the war still lived on. A man stepped carefully through the undergrowth, his uniform torn but immaculate, his rifle gleaming with care. The metal was old, yet polished. His movements were disciplined, precise, every step cautious, every sound studied. His name was Hiroo Onoda, a former intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. For him, the war had never ended. To the outside world, Japan had long since rebuilt. Cities once reduced to ash now glowed with neon lights. Children who hadn't been born when the bombs fell were now adults living in peace. But Onoda knew none of this. In his mind, the empire still stood, and his mission, given to him in 1944, remained unfulfilled. He had been sent to this small island in the final days of Japan's crumbling empire, ordered to conduct sabotage against the invading Allied forces. "Hold the island," his commander had told him. "Do not surrender. Do not die by your own hand. The war may take years, but we will return for you." Those words became his gospel. For decades, Onoda survived in the jungle, believing each passing year was merely a phase of the same war he had sworn to fight. He lived off coconuts and bananas, stole rice from nearby villages, and waged his own guerrilla campaign against farmers he believed to be enemy agents. Villagers told stories of a ghost soldier, a man who lived in the mountains, who appeared suddenly in the night to steal food and vanish into the forest. Few believed he was real. Fewer still imagined he had once served in the emperor's army. But he was real, and he was still fighting. Hiroo Onoda was not a fanatic in the way the world often imagines. He was, above all, a man of discipline and loyalty qualities that had once defined Japan's military identity. But in the isolation of the jungle, those virtues became chains. His sense of honor would not allow him to question his mission. His belief in the empire would not let him accept defeat. And so, for nearly 30 years after Japan's surrender, one man continued to fight a war that had ended for everyone else. The world would come to know him as the soldier who refused to surrender, the last man of World War II. But to understand how Hiroo Onoda came to live in that eternal battlefield, we must return to a time when loyalty to the emperor was the highest law, and death for honor was not only expected, it was celebrated. Part 2. The Empire's Shadow. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Kamikawa Village, Japan. Like many young men of his generation, he grew up in a nation transformed by war and nationalism. Japan, once isolated from the world, had risen with astonishing speed, building an empire across Asia under the banner of the emperor and the divine destiny of the Japanese race. By the time Onoda reached adulthood, the winds of conflict had already engulfed the Pacific. The military's grip on society was absolute. Children were taught to worship the emperor as a living god. Honor, obedience, and sacrifice were the pillars of the Japanese spirit. To die for the empire was the highest form of virtue. To surrender was the deepest shame. Onoda, bright and disciplined, joined the Imperial Army in 1942. He trained as an intelligence officer, specializing in guerrilla warfare and psychological operations. His instructors were men hardened by years of combat in China, Burma, and the Pacific Islands. Men who taught their recruits that retreat was cowardice and surrender, treason. In 1944, as the tide of war turned against Japan, Onoda received his most critical orders. He was to deploy to the Philippines, to the small island of Lubang, west of Manila. His mission: to disrupt enemy operations, destroy airstrips and docks, and gather intelligence, all while avoiding capture. His orders were clear and absolute. He must never surrender. He must never take his own life. He must continue the mission until his superior officer personally relieved him of duty. Those 3 rules would define the rest of his life. When Onoda arrived at Lubang in December 1944, the situation was already desperate. American forces were advancing rapidly through the Philippines. The Japanese garrison on the island was scattered and demoralized. Supplies were low, and communication with headquarters had broken down. Onoda quickly assumed command of a small group of soldiers, men who shared his sense of duty and believed Japan would eventually reclaim the island. Together, they retreated into the mountains and began their campaign of survival and sabotage. When the war ended in August 1945, they never received the news. The emperor's voice announcing Japan's surrender over the radio never reached them. To Onoda and his men, the sudden silence from headquarters, the lack of reinforcements, the leaflets dropped from the sky declaring, "The war is over." All of it looked like enemy deception. They had been trained to believe the Allies would use psychological tricks to weaken their resolve. So when the villagers left offerings of food and messages pleading for peace, Onoda's group assumed it was a trap. They stayed hidden, determined to wait for the day Japan returned for them. And so the jungle became their world. As months turned into years, their uniforms tattered, but their rifles still ready. The men continued to patrol the forests. They wrote reports, built makeshift shelters, and attacked anyone they believed to be enemies. Each gunshot echoed across the island, a ghostly reminder of a war that had ended long ago. Gradually, one by one, the men fell. Some were killed in skirmishes. Others, captured or wounded, vanished. But Onoda refused to believe they were gone for good. In his mind, they had been redeployed, or rescued, or still fighting somewhere else. By 1950, he was alone, the last officer of an army that no longer existed. Still, his uniform was pressed. His rifle was clean. His orders were unchanged. The Empire would return, he told himself. The Emperor would call him home. All he had to do was keep fighting. Part 3. The War That Never Ended. In the autumn of 1945, the world celebrated peace. In Tokyo, the rising sun flag was lowered for the last time, and a new chapter of history began. But in the dense jungles of Lubang Island, that peace never arrived. Hiroo Onoda and his 3 remaining comrades, Corporal Shimada, Private Kozuka, and Private Akatsu, continued their mission as if nothing had changed. They were convinced that Japan's apparent defeat was only a temporary setback, and that the Emperor's forces would soon return to reclaim the Pacific. When Allied aircraft dropped leaflets announcing Japan's surrender, Onoda examined them carefully under the dim glow of his campfire. "Propaganda," he declared. "A trick to make us surrender." The others agreed. They had seen similar tactics used by Japan itself during the war. Psychological operations meant to break the enemy's will. Why should this be any different? Months passed. Then, years. The men moved through the forest like shadows, living off the land and stealing from local farms. They hunted wild pigs, gathered fruit, and cooked in hidden caves. Their uniforms rotted, their boots fell apart, but their discipline never wavered. Every night, they cleaned their rifles and wrote field notes, recording weather, troop movements, and imagined enemy positions. Whenever they heard gunfire or saw lights from the villages, they assumed the enemy was near. They prepared ambushes, set traps, and fired when threatened. To the farmers and fishermen of Lubang, these mysterious soldiers were a nightmare. Unseen ghosts who killed livestock, burned crops, and sometimes attacked people who came too close. The locals began calling them the mountain devils. Attempts to reach them failed. The Japanese government, upon hearing reports of survivors, sent search teams and even dropped more leaflets with personal messages from family members. One message came from Onoda's own brother, urging him to come home. He read it with suspicion. "If this were truly from my brother," he told his men, "it would have been delivered through official channels." To Onoda, the absence of military verification meant the war still raged. Then came the first loss. In 1949, Private Akatsu surrendered to Philippine authorities. For Onoda, it was unthinkable betrayal of the highest order. He believed Akatsu had either defected or been brainwashed. When word came through village gossip that Akatsu was alive and living peacefully, Onoda dismissed it as an enemy ruse. The war, in his mind, had simply changed form. Years turned into decades. In 1954, Corporal Shimada was shot and killed during a skirmish with local police. Onoda and Kozuka buried him in the jungle and carried on. They still believed Japan was regrouping, that the world's chaos, the Korean War, the Cold War, were signs that the empire might yet rise again. For Onoda, each sunrise brought proof of his purpose. Each storm that tore through the forest tested his will. He saw himself as the final guardian of a sacred mission, upholding the emperor's command against all odds. In the outside world, Japan had transformed. The once militaristic nation had become an industrial democracy. Children learned English in schools. Radios and televisions filled homes with Western music and laughter. The idea that a soldier still fought in the jungle somewhere sounded like a legend. But deep inside Lubang, Hiroo Onoda remained patrolling, hiding, surviving. His world had stopped in 1945, and he refused to let it move forward. For him, surrender was not peace. It was dishonor. And as long as one soldier remained on duty, the war, in some small way, continued. Part 4. Alone in the jungle. By the late 1960s, Hiroo Onoda was the last man of his unit still alive. Private Kozuka, his closest comrade, had stayed with him through 25 years of struggle, bound by the same faith in their orders. Together, they lived like ghosts, silent, patient, and invisible. They avoided villagers, raided fields for food, and occasionally fired at police patrols, convinced they were part of the American occupation force. Every encounter reinforced Onoda's belief that the enemy still controlled the island. Time blurred. Seasons passed without meaning. The jungle became both his prison and his home. He memorized every sound, every rustle of leaves, every echo of gunfire. He knew which rivers flooded after rain, which trees bore fruit, which stars marked the months. His world was small, But it was absolute, a world where duty never ended, and surrender was death. In 1959, Japanese newspapers briefly reported sightings of 2 surviving soldiers on Lubang. Journalists speculated that they were stragglers from the war. The government sent search teams, including relatives of missing soldiers. But Onoda and Kozuka always escaped into the jungle before being found. Each failed attempt convinced Onoda further that these searches were part of the enemy's psychological warfare. By 1972, nearly 30 years after the war, Kozuka was killed during a clash with local police while burning rice stores, still carrying out sabotage missions. His death left Onoda completely alone. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel something close to grief, but even that he suppressed. He buried Kozuka beneath the trees and continued to patrol, reporting every movement, every sound. In notebooks he kept hidden in oilcloth, he wrote detailed observations as if sending them to Tokyo. Enemy morale remains low. Local cooperation with occupation forces continues. I will hold position. Lof. Lof lof. Lof lof. Lof lof. Lof lof. Lof lof. Lof lof. He cleaned his rifle daily. He repaired his uniform with vines. He polished his knife until it gleamed in the dim light. He had spent nearly 30 years waiting for orders that would never come. At night, he sometimes heard airplanes passing overhead. He would look up, watching the blinking lights cross the stars, and wonder what kind of new aircraft they were, or if perhaps they were Japanese reconnaissance planes, returning at last. In reality, they were commercial jets, carrying tourists between Manila and Tokyo, 2 worlds he no longer recognized. By then, he had become both legend and mystery. Villagers spoke of him with a mix of fear and awe. Some believed he was a spirit of the war, condemned to wander until he fulfilled his orders. Others pitied him, a man so loyal he could not see the truth. And then, one day in 1974, a Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki arrived on the island with an impossible mission: to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. Few believed he would find anything. But within days, Suzuki did what governments, search parties, and armies could not. He found Hiroo Onoda alive, armed, and still waiting for the Emperor's command. Part V. The Return. The year was 1974. Nearly 3 decades had passed since Japan's surrender. The world had changed beyond recognition. Men had walked on the moon. The Cold War divided the planet. Yet on the remote Philippine island of Lubang, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda still held his post. Then came Norio Suzuki, a 4-year-old Japanese adventurer and drifter, searching for something he couldn't quite define. Suzuki told friends he wanted to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Most people laughed, but he meant it. He set out for Lubang armed with little more than a camera, a tent, and a map. Unlike the military search teams before him, Suzuki approached the task with simplicity and respect. He didn't carry weapons or leaflets. He carried understanding. When he finally reached the dense forests of the island, he called out softly into the trees, "Onoda-san, the Emperor and the people of Japan are worried about you." There was silence. Then, from behind the foliage, a man appeared, cautious, lean, rifle in hand, wearing a tattered Japanese uniform that looked like it belonged in a museum. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. Suzuki didn't move. He simply bowed. The 2 men spoke for hours, their conversation bridging 3 decades of history. Suzuki told Onoda that the war was over, that Japan had been rebuilt, that the Emperor himself had long since renounced his divinity. Onoda listened quietly, but suspicion lingered. For years, he had been deceived by enemy propaganda. He would not surrender so easily. He told Suzuki, "If the Emperor or a superior officer orders me to stop fighting, I will lay down my arms. But until then, my orders remain." Suzuki understood. He returned to Japan and launched a search for Onoda's former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had given Onoda his original orders in 1944. Taniguchi, now a retired bookseller living in quiet obscurity, was stunned when he learned Onoda was still alive. He agreed to travel to the Philippines. On the 9th of March, 1974, the 2 men met in the jungle. Onoda stood at attention, his uniform ragged but spotless, his rifle gleaming. Taniguchi read aloud the Imperial Army's formal order, relieving him of duty. His voice trembled as he said the words, "In accordance with the Imperial command, all combat activity shall cease. The 14th Area Army has been dissolved. You are hereby relieved of all military duties." For a long moment, Onoda didn't move. Then, slowly, he saluted. Nearly 30 years after the end of the war, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda finally lowered his weapon. He emerged from the jungle carrying his Arisaka rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, several grenades, and the sword his father had given him before he left for war. Everything was in perfect condition. When he stepped into the sunlight, the waiting crowd gasped. The world had forgotten men like him, soldiers who had fought not for victory, but for a code that no longer existed. Onoda formally surrendered his rifle to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who, recognizing his loyalty and the extraordinary circumstances, granted him a full pardon for the decades of conflict and loss that had occurred. For the first time since 1944, Hiroo Onoda was free. He was 52 years old. Part VI. The War Within. Returning to Japan, Onoda was greeted with both awe and confusion. Crowds filled the streets to see him, the man who had fought a one-man war for 30 years. Newspapers called him the last samurai. Television cameras followed his every move. But to Onoda, Japan was unrecognizable. The empire he had devoted his life to defending was gone. The emperor no longer commanded divine authority. The young people of Japan spoke casually, laughed openly, and seemed to have no memory of the discipline or sacrifice he had once considered sacred. He walked through Tokyo in disbelief. Neon lights illuminated streets that had once been reduced to rubble. Western music filled the air. Soldiers no longer marched. Instead, businessmen hurried between trains, carrying briefcases instead of rifles. The Japan he had imagined, the one he had sworn to protect, existed only in his mind. When reporters asked if he regretted not surrendering earlier, Onoda shook his head. "I did my duty," he said simply. "I was a soldier, and I received an order. I followed it." Yet beneath that stoic exterior, he carried a deep sorrow. Hundreds of people had died as a result of his actions. Families had lost fathers, brothers, and sons. Villagers on Lubang had lived in fear for decades. Onoda offered apologies, but he never fully accepted blame. To him, he had been at war, and in war, death was inevitable. Unable to adjust to modern Japan, Onoda soon left. In 1975, he moved to Brazil, where he began working on a cattle ranch among Japanese immigrants. There, surrounded by open land and silence, he found a measure of peace. He married, farmed, and lived quietly for years, far from the noise and confusion of the modern world. But even in Brazil, the habits of a soldier never left him. He kept his tools perfectly organized, his schedule rigid, his discipline intact. Eventually, he returned to Japan in the 1982nd, founding a nature school for young people. His goal was to teach self-reliance, perseverance, and endurance values he believed modern Japan had lost. "The world is full of distractions," he told his students. "A person must know what they stand for, and they must never run away from it." In his final years, Onoda came to symbolize both the strength and the tragedy of absolute loyalty. Some saw him as a hero, a man of unbreakable conviction. Others saw him as a relic of a darker time, proof of how deeply ideology can shape a human mind. In interviews, he sometimes reflected on the strange irony of his life. "I believed I was serving my country," he said. "But when I came home, my country no longer existed." Hiroo Onoda died in 2014, at the age of 91. His story remains one of the most remarkable in the history of war, not for the battles he fought, but for the war he carried within himself. Part 7. Legacy and Reflection. When Hiroo Onoda passed away in 2014, the world remembered him with both admiration and unease. His life stood as a monument to loyalty and as a warning about the power of belief. For many in Japan, he represented the last echo of an older world. A world of duty, hierarchy, and unquestioning obedience to authority. The same virtues that had driven Japan's soldiers to fight with such ferocity had also trapped Onoda in a prison of conviction. He had become a symbol of devotion, but also of isolation. A man who followed orders so faithfully that he became lost in time. His story provoked difficult questions, even decades later. Was he a hero, a soldier who kept his oath in the face of impossible odds? Or was he a victim, a man so deeply conditioned by war and ideology that he could no longer see the truth, even when it surrounded him? For the people of Lubang Island, those questions were not abstract. They remembered the fear, the deaths, the burned rice fields, and the years of anxiety caused by a man who believed the war still raged. When Onoda's story reached the global stage, many of those same villagers spoke of forgiveness. They said they had long understood that he was not acting out of cruelty, but out of conviction. That mix of tragedy and understanding became the essence of his legend. In Japan, Onoda's name was often mentioned alongside the transformation of the nation itself. After the war, Japan renounced militarism, rebuilt its cities, and embraced peace and progress. But in that new identity, something was lost. The old sense of duty, sacrifice, and purpose that had once defined its people. To some, Onoda was a reminder of the strength of that older spirit, the discipline that rebuilt Japan from ashes. To others, he was proof of the danger of blind loyalty, of what happens when obedience replaces thought. When he spoke publicly in his later years, Onoda was calm, deliberate, even humble. He often said he bore no resentment toward the government or the people who had forgotten him. He accepted his fate as a soldier who had done what he believed was right. But he also expressed sadness at how the world had changed, how people had become, in his eyes, too comfortable, too disconnected from duty. War is terrible, he once said. But war also shows you what you are. In the jungle, I knew who I was. Here, in peace, people do not know. There was something haunting in those words, an understanding that, for Onoda, the jungle had not only been a battlefield, it had been a place of purpose. When that purpose ended, so too did a part of his identity. Historians later described his survival as one of the most extraordinary cases of endurance and mental resilience in human history. 30 years in isolation, surviving on instinct, memory, and belief, and never losing sight of his mission. His body aged, but his conviction did not. Modern psychologists saw in his story the extreme limits of human adaptability, how the mind can reshape reality itself when driven by faith. Soldiers from around the world studied his case, not as a tale of madness, but as a study in willpower and the psychology of obedience. And yet, beneath all that analysis and debate, Onoda's story remains deeply human. A young man sent to war. A commander's order taken as sacred truth. A life consumed by loyalty and silence. When he finally laid down his rifle, the war had long ceased to exist, except inside him. The man who never surrendered. Today, Hiroo Onoda's uniform rests in museums. His story is taught in classrooms and retold in films and documentaries. Visitors to Lubang can still see the caves and clearings where he once lived. The quiet places, where time itself seemed to stand still. To some, he will always be the soldier who refused to surrender. To others, the man who couldn't let go of the past. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere between those extremes. Hiroo Onoda's life reminds us that history is not just about battles and nations, but about the fragile line between duty and illusion, between courage and tragedy. He was, in many ways, both hero and victim, a reflection of a world that demanded absolute faith from its sons, and then moved on without them. When asked late in life what he had learned from his 30 years of war, Onoda answered softly, "Human beings can endure more than they believe, but endurance means nothing without purpose. And purpose can be dangerous if you never question where it leads you." His words echo through history, a whisper from the jungle, a reminder that even the strongest convictions must one day meet the truth.